Our third panel is entitled The Gut Microbiome, a Catalyst for Research and Innovation. And one of the centers leading this research is Hoag, through its Hoag Family Cancer Institute. The Hoag Family Cancer Institute can boast direct access to advanced therapies based on the newest cancer science, including those in the earliest phases of clinical testing before they become widely available, and potential exciting deliveries from the gut microbiome certainly fall within that category. At Hoag, multi-specialty teams of experts, sought-after oncology physicians work together to develop personalized treatment plans tailored to a patient's unique genetics. Hoag's robust research and clinical trial programs are efficient and effective, and their coordinated care and patient support programs are integrated. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Simon Hoag, Director of Neuro-Oncology at Hoag Family Cancer Institute and a triple board-certified medical oncologist and neuro-oncologist. Dr. Hoag's areas of expertise include treating primary brain and spine cancers, as well as thoracic cancers and melanoma. Having received multiple honors throughout his career and being inducted as a fellow of the American College of Physicians, Dr. Hoag has also received the Healthcare Hero Award from the Head for the Cure Foundation and the Exemplary Service Award from the UNC Division of Medical Oncology, along with multiple research grants. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Hoag.
All right. Thank you so much for this opportunity to introduce Hoag. I am relatively new to the system, but so far it has been an amazing experience. So I prepare some brief remarks about some of my experiences. But on behalf of the Hoag Family Cancer Institute, I want to thank the organizing committee for this year's Nixon National Cancer Conference. It is an honor to be among such dedicated cancer specialists and researchers, all of us striving for the betterment of humanity, a testament to the broader spirit of collaboration and scientific advancement that forms the basis for this year's conference. I would like to also mention that no one institution or organization has a monopoly on cancer care and scientific advances. We are not meant to be siloed off, a theme that has been discussed here multiple times. We are all very much part of the fabric that binds our collective desire to end cancer. At Hoag, we're doing our part by bringing together cross-functional, multidisciplinary teams of cancer experts running innovative early-phase clinical trials, contributing to our understanding of the mechanisms of cancer, raising awareness of the burden of cancer in our community, and building partnerships that help bridge together expertise across industry as well as academia. Our approach is streamlined by a robust infrastructure that allows us to implement clinical trials in half the time of larger centers, at least per my experience. And our benefactors, many of whom live in Newport Beach, Corona Del Mar, continue to give generously to support our mission-critical endeavors. Recruitment at Hoag has been very robust, with many academically minded clinicians joining the organization, like Dr. Raskin, and even those with R01 funding, like Dr. Eulander. As for myself, like I said, I joined in August of 2023. I trained or held faculty academic positions at 3 major NCI-designated cancer centers, Dartmouth, Duke, and the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, all of which have been formative in my personal development as a clinician and a researcher. I owe so much to my mentors in academic centers, at these academic centers. But the Hoag model, and what attracted me to it, is its difference, and it allows for exploration and funding opportunities abound for high risk, high reward, scientifically boundary pushing endeavors. This is unique to the field and something that I very much appreciate. The Cancer Institute continues to grow, and I truly feel that the future here is quite bright. Again, thank you for allowing me to speak, and thank you all for attending this incredibly important event.
Thank you very much, Doctor. The moderator of the next panel is Dr. Marcel Brink, President of City of Hope Cancer Center and National Medical Center Chief Physician Executive, and the Deanna and Steve Campbell Chief Physician Executive Distinguished Chair, who is a globally recognized leader in the basic and translational science of bone marrow transplantation. Dr. Van den Brink has pursued innovative ways to improve and optimize bone marrow transplantation, developing strategies to make the process less toxic and to lower the rate of recurrence. Dr. Van den Brink is a member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. Before he joined City of Hope, he served in leadership positions at Memorial Sloan Kettering for 24 years. Please welcome Dr. Van den Brink, who will introduce our panel.
Thank you very much. So it's a big honor, first and most of all, to be part of this conference with so many fantastic speakers. What I would like to do is, since this is a post-lunch meeting that we have here, do mention the word poop one time, so then we got it all over. You can snicker, etc. But yes, that's what we're going to discuss. Because that is where most of the microbiome is. And just to set the stage a little bit, right? Why even be interested in this, and how to bring it also out of the health food store and the public media type of stories. Think for one moment about where the microbiome is and how many of these microbes you actually have. Those numbers are pretty much equal to the number of cells that you have in your body. And I think the whole premise probably for the way that we think about this is that you might want to rethink who you actually are and think about yourself as a super organism that is basically a symbiosis between all of these microbes and your own cells. And if you accept that premise, and if you think like Darwin, you almost have to, because why would we have developed like that if there wasn't some benefit to that? Then maybe you can start to understand that all of these microbes, in many different ways, by direct cell-to-cell contact, by products that they make, metabolites, etc., can have impact all over your body, both in health and in a disease. So that's really where we're coming from. Those are the kind of topics that we would like to discuss. And I want to take the Pistors format that I saw this morning and start off with a little round of intros for each of us, right? You can talk a little bit about who you are and specifically talk about how your work is actually connected to a microbiome. If you really want to, you can add a fun fact, I think he called that, so you can think now about what you want to mention. So I'll start with myself. So the whole reason why I got interested is, as you heard, I'm a bone marrow transplanter. And it was already known since the 1970s from mouse models and also from human studies that changes in the gut flora could have impact on outcomes. And it actually led for a couple of decades to people thinking that all these transplants need to be done in a completely sterile fashion. And then basically for a couple of years, nobody could really figure out anymore what should we do, how far should we go with that. And then this new science came up of sequencing of the microbiome so that we could know in much more detail what it actually looks like. So that is really how in 2009 I got into this field. And since that time, we have done many studies, mostly in a transplant, but also specifically in checkpoint blockade, CAR cell therapy. And the general premise for us was that changes in the microbiome can change the efficacy and the toxicity of all these different therapies. And we can get later into why that is. As a fun fact, as you can tell by now from my Dutch accent, I grew up in the ultimate Holland with all of the windmills below the water level. I had a pair of wooden shoes also. And my first job when I was 14 years old was peeling tulip bulbs, a job that could only be found in the few towns where I grew up. So I want to hand it over to Dr. Raskin.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Elizabeth Raskin, and as he alluded to, we can say poop. I'm a poop surgeon. So I'm a colorectal surgeon. I'm double board certified in surgery, but I'm also a fellow in integrative medicine. So I study right now at the University of Arizona under the Andrew Weil Center of Integrative Medicine. And I have found that that level of education is taking me to places that I just never knew I needed as a surgeon. So as many of you know, surgeons are like the mechanics of medicine, right? They go in and they cut something out. I had found over my career that we would do surgery, we would take out cancer, diverticulitis, Crohn's disease, and patients still weren't well. And I had to wonder to myself, what am I not providing for them? And I realized so much because I was trained more as a mechanic, but not as a healer. And so in the field of integrative medicine, we learn about these tools, how to heal. And a big thing and theme that we've been talking about here has been food as medicine. And that is one of the ways that we heal, but there's so many other ways. And I'm fortunate to be in an educational program learning that and then providing that for my patients. So I do consider myself an integrative surgeon. Fun fact, I am a rugby player, and I played rugby on a men's rugby team back in the 90s and became a voracious rugby fan. And I think that of anything that prepared me enough for surgical residency and surgical training, it was my career in rugby.
I'm not sure if any of us can actually top that, but
Go ahead and try.
let me hand over to Dr. Lee.
Yes, well, it's a pleasure to be on this panel. And as you know from last night, I'm Dr. William Lee. I'm a vascular biologist, an internist by training. I run the Angiogenesis Foundation, and my passion has really been on developmental therapeutics in whatever that context meant, from looking at disease and health common denominators. Disease common denominators, we can actually develop anti-angiogenic drugs for cancer, for example. But I started to realize that the common denominator approach, looking at the health component, brought me inevitably to thinking about the gut. And I think, as we'll talk about on this panel, there was always a very personal relationship we all have with our gut, myself included, where your belly didn't feel so well, but you thought you would just get over it. And now the science is telling us that we can actually interpret that. We're starting to be able to interpret that in more meaningful ways in health. And when it comes to cancer, suddenly the field has sharpened itself to give us an awareness that the gut microbiome plays indeed a role in not only whether we might develop cancer, but whether we might respond to the treatments, or whether the cancer might come back. And so this suddenly becomes a field where life and death becomes the stakes at hand. Fun fact, I grew up playing the piano. I performed with the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra, and really enjoy music.
Wonderful. That was actually very, very good. That does match what we heard about the rugby. Dr. Jain.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sunny Jain, CEO and founder of Flore and Flore Clinical. We're a precision nutrition and molecular diagnostics company. My background is in molecular genomics, genetics, molecular medicine, and microbiology, and started a career working for reference labs like LabCorp, Quest, more recently Illumina before starting Flore, and had the good fortune of sequencing the first clinical whole genome, and thought that by sequencing the first clinical whole genome, we might be able to unmask all the myriad of disease and conditions that we have through genomics. And ultimately, we've now found 10, 15 years later that perhaps that place is more for rare disease and conditions. And that's led me to focus in on the microbiome, as well as a personal component of it. And maybe to tie in my fun fact with the personal component of why we started Flore, I started it because my son was having GI issues and wanted to find a solution for him, and tested different types of methodologies, just happenstance due to my background, and got a lab space and put my credit card down, and started spending some money on figuring out what was going on in his gut, tried 16S, tried metagenomics. And once we analyzed his gut through metagenomics, I consider it the most important data set I've ever looked at in my life. It showed all these inflammatory microbes that were inside of his intestinal tract. And to date, I haven't seen that level or prevalence of these inflammatory microbes in other children. And we took action. And we worked on modulating his gut microbiome and brought those inflammatory microbes down over time. And happy to report he's a healthy, happy 7-year-old boy now. But my fun anecdote is that now my children, I both have a 7-year-old and a 2.5-year-old. They are the most microbiome metagenomic mapped children on the planet. One of them's got 20 longitudinal microbiome maps. The younger one, only 2.5, has 16 longitudinal microbiome maps. And I've really incorporated it as a standard of care for them.
Thank you very much. So what I thought we should do is maybe first start with some questions within each of your areas. So if I can start with Dr. Raskin. As a surgeon, you of course do a lot of things that have impact on microbiome, from pre and post care, post-op care, the use of antibiotics, and so on and so on. So can you talk a little bit about, first of all, what is happening in the context of a surgery, and second, what are you doing with that? How are you dealing with all these changes?
Sure. So when we talk about surgery for colon cancer, digestive disease, we have to recognize that much like the diagnosis, the term surgery can evoke a really emotional response. Patients immediately have a sense of apprehension, have a sense of fear, and coming into a surgeon's office is a very frightening experience for many patients. It mirrors what it feels like to give the diagnosis and receive the diagnosis of a serious illness like cancer. And so the way I approach the microbiome with patients is the moment that I meet them. It's called a liminal episode. When you walk through the threshold of their exam room to introduce yourself, you're making a connection. And that connection is saying that I'm here to help navigate and to pair with you in your journey in cancer care or diverticular disease or inflammatory bowel disease. And we start to peel the onion as to who is this person, what matters to them, and inevitably we get to potentially some of the root causes of these diseases. In fact, a question I commonly ask my patients is, why do you think this happened? Why do you think you have this diagnosis? And it is shocking to find that many people have a sense of guilt, that cancer came to them because of something that they did or something about who they are. And so you're realizing that the diagnosis and the treatment is so wrapped up in the mental health and the well-being of your patient that you have to attend to that. The stress of receiving that diagnosis can alter your microbiome, right? We know that. We know that the stress that we live with can have so many effects on our global health. And so when I meet that patient, my goal is to figure out what is their MIT. MIT stands for most important thing. How do I want to anchor their care? You tell me your most important thing is your family and being there, then that's what we're anchoring your care around. We are looking at the things that you can do and empower yourself to be the best caretaker for yourself, for your family. And then we add in all the elements that come externally. Medicine has always been about what can something else do for me? But my goal is to activate that sense within us of I can heal myself first, and then I can receive care externally to have the most profound effect. And so we talk about nutrition, we talk about sleep, exercise, we talk about stressors in life. The list goes on, but it's very individualized and very personalized from my perspective. And then we get to the surgery part. And the surgery part, as Dr. Vanderbrink has just alluded to, can affect our microbiome because we are doing those things. We are creating intentionally a stressful situation because we're doing surgery. It's traumatic. We're giving antibiotics. We're doing bowel preps. We're asking patients to eat in a different way because maybe they're obstructed or they're perforated or they have some inflammation that can't get calmed down. And then afterwards, we're saying, okay, heal up and get back to normal. Well, the truth is we never do get back to normal. We get back to a new normal, and that new normal is carrying the weight of the trauma that we experienced. And what we need to know is that that is something longitudinal. We need to help these patients heal not only from the condition that they were diagnosed with, but heal in the most global way. And so my approach to surgery and to cancer care is with that integrative lens.
Thank you very much. That actually touches on a lot of subjects that we will get back to also. I'm going to skip Dr. Lee for one moment and go to Dr. Jain first, just to get a little bit of a sequence here, because I want to talk next about testing. So there are 23andMe-like popular tests out there. There are commercial tests. Some of the tests have been brought into the clinic. What's your current thinking about that? What kind of testing should we do, can we do, is out there that we can work with? What are the implications? So give us your view about that.
Yeah, I think maybe just adding on to what Dr. Raskin has focused in on, that integrative approach. I think one of those approaches is to actually test, then treat, and actually get to some of these root cause types of planning and root cause types of understanding. And some of the speakers today have already talked about how we need to take a step back, maybe even from thinking of, okay, you have a gene and you have a gene fusion, and we need to do the treatment. Is there more systems biology type approach? Do we need to look at multi-factors of testing? Is microbiome a part of that? Whether you have a good microbiome releasing positive things, what they call postbiotics or metabolites, or if you have a poor microbiome that's in a dysbiosis releasing negative factors like toxins. We think that type of testing that's giving you that greater insight, it's really helpful. And so integrating maybe genomics testing along with microbiome testing, and then also doing your standard of care testing so that you can get a more complete picture and then draw a plan, allows for a lot more intricate decision-making and better treatment outcomes.
Thank you. So now, of course, going to therapies, right? Everybody would love to see that this field already leads to some kind of therapy, a diet therapy, fecal transplants, pills with some kind of bacteria in it. So what do you think at the moment, Dr. Lee? Where are we? What kind of therapies should we be thinking of?
Well, before we talk about the therapies, let me lay out some data that has come out, because the microbiome is often thought of as a popular wellness, influencer topic, and we all know it's kind of important, but again, I sort of want to focus it on, as a scientist, a clinical scientist, I like to look at the data. So we know that the tumor microenvironment is really important. We know that cancers, tumors are composed of different cell types, both healthy and not so healthy, and frankly, malignant cells. But we didn't actually expect, I didn't expect as a cancer researcher, that there would be a completely different cell type that would be not near the tumor necessarily, but far away in our gut, that could actually affect cancer no matter where it lives, whether it's in the brain or the lung or the breast or the prostate. And that's really the gut microbiome. And I was initially kind of skeptical about the gut microbiome, but then started to see papers published in journals like Science and Nature and The Lancet. These are, the hard-hitting, credible, peer-reviewed studies. And I began seeing, starting in about 2017, 18, I was in Paris. I had convened a conference that was called, it was a cancer conference where you couldn't talk about chemotherapy or targeted therapy. You had to talk about everything else. That was what the researchers were invited to talk about. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Laurence Zitvokel, who has now become a leader in immuno-oncology and the microbiome, presented a study that had been embargoed, about 200 patients who had received an immunotherapy. And she looked at the differences between those who responded to the treatment and those that didn't respond, and did a very comprehensive analysis, and found that the biggest difference, the most significant difference, was found in the microbiome. That responders had certain organisms, one particular organism called Akkermansia that was Mucinophila that was present, and other non-responders had it absent. And this was really kind of a discovery, but she was able to then take the Akkermansia from the responding patients and bring it to the lab and put that bacteria in mice who were not responding to immunotherapy. And when she did the transplant in the mouse, got them to respond to immunotherapy. And then when she gave them an antibiotic and wiped out that bacteria, they no longer responded to the treatment. So this was sort of clinic observation to the lab, and then back to the clinic. And that, to me, was sort of a gate opening to looking at data. Okay, so that's one organism, and we don't know if it's the only organism or the right organism or for whom it's important, but it's tied to a treatment response characteristic for immunotherapy. Then you fast forward to a more recent paper that came out a few months ago looking at breast cancer and looking at mortality outcomes in women who had been treated with antibiotics after receiving a breast cancer diagnosis. And what was startling was to find that those women who had received one or more courses of antibiotics had a poorer outcome. And the only real kind of direction, finger that pointed towards was perhaps an effect of the antibiotics on the gut microbiome. Then the studies from MD Anderson started to come out looking at the correlation between not only organisms, but dietary fiber and the intake of dietary fiber and the makeup of the gut microbiome and cancer response. And some of the emerging data was really eye-opening, that 5 to 6 grams of dietary fiber that would feed gut bacteria like Ruminococcus, for example, would lead to up to a 30% decrease in mortality in patients with melanoma taking immunotherapy. So none of these are guideline directing discoveries, but what it does mean is that this is a avenue of research that must be pursued and has to be important. So at the very beginning, Marcel, you mentioned that that we are not just humans, but we are mixed organisms. And there's a term for us. It's called holobionte. A holobionte is an organism that's not just made of one cell type, but multiple cell types. So we're not actually human. We're partly human, and we're partly bacteria. And if you think about how profound that is, and recognize that outside of oncology, we realize that the gut microbiome affect healthy, unhealthy, in ways that we don't fully understand, is connected to Parkinson's disease, is connected to Alzheimer's, is connected to diabetes, is connected to many chronic disease, cardiovascular disease as well. Suddenly, we have to, I think, surrender our bias in medicine that this is only about targeting the tumor, to really begin thinking that we need to really have a better understanding of this. Now, how does it actually come back to treatment? Number one, I have worked with Sunny and his group at Sun Genomics to be able to profile the gut bacteria of cancer patients. We don't have a full map yet, but we know it's possible to be done. Consumers can actually go out to order this. The question is, what do oncologists do with it? What does the cancer care team do with this information? We're not sure yet, but I think in the coming years, we're gonna have more clarity. One thing we can try to do is encourage patients to actually do the health care, the oncology care that doesn't happen in the infusion clinic, which is to eat more dietary fiber, eat more plant-based foods, cut down on ultra-processed foods that we know impact on the gut microbiome. I learned recently, to my surprise, that low-fat yogurt, which is yogurt that has the fat removed, changes in its consistency more like clotted milk, which is not very pleasant to eat. And although low-fat yogurt is supposed to be healthier for you, the way the food manufacturers give you the mouthfeel for full-fat yogurt is they add emulsifiers. And recent data has shown the emulsifiers in low-fat yogurt, polysorbate 80, carrageenan, et cetera, actually damage the gut microbiome, as do artificial sweeteners, as do many other additives to food. So now we're thinking about beyond antibiotics, which are given routinely in surgery, suddenly food as medicine takes on a whole other realm of, are we actually supporting or damaging one of our body's health defense systems, which is our gut microbiome? So I think that the jury is still out of what therapy we can actually do, even what diagnostics we should be doing, but we know it's important.
So I want to get back to this topic of diet, because that's definitely on everybody's mind. But I want to follow up on some of the things that you said. So that same study, right, that you published in 2000, that was published in 2017, was actually a back-to-back science articles from many groups showing that changes in the gut microbiome could have impact on checkpoint blockade. That was widely publicized. And you might know of a study in the same journal, actually, Science, that demonstrated a couple of years later when they simply asked patients getting checkpoint blockade therapy, are you taking an over-the-counter probiotic? They found a fair number of patients who were actually doing that. And when they analyzed how these patients fared, they did worse. So then they took that to a mouse model and they mimicked that. So they had a mouse getting, again, some kind of tumor, treat with a checkpoint blockade, and gave some of these mice the same over-the-counter preps. And they saw again that these mice did worse. So one of the messages that if you get anything out of this, I think that we really need to understand the microbiome makes a real impact on outcomes of therapies, and do-it-yourself health food store over-the-counter therapies are not innocuous. They can actually be harmful. One of the things that we did is we went to a local pharmacy and we bought pretty much all of the pills that they sell there. And we analyzed them. We had, over the 14 years that we were doing this kind of work, we had made a whole wheel, a taxonomy of all of the bacteria that were linked to good outcomes or bad outcomes. We looked at all of the bacteria that were part of these pills, and most of them were in the bad zone, in the red zone. So again, I think we need to be very careful with these kind of therapies and really use a scientific rigor. And also watch with our patients who are reading all of this stuff. Tuesday, New York Times, what is a healthy microbiome, 15 questions. And if you read the answers, there's not much there, actually, because most of these things we don't know yet. But patients would like to jump on this and do something, often without telling it to their doctor. So with that, you are dying to make a comment, so I'll give you first a chance or not.
I'm always looking to make a comment.
Yeah, no,
but,
please, I'll pause.
The funny thing to me is that you go back about 100 plus years or more. When we first understood what germ theory was, where germs created disease, first of all, people had a hard time even believing that, right? That it was actually a germ. They thought it was the air, what they called miasma, like bad air. We fast forward now and say we didn't believe that germs were causing disease. Then we did believe, and then we started to hate these bacteria, and then we started to use all of these sanitizers and to hyper-sterilize our environment, only to realize that we're harming ourselves by doing some of that. Exposure to good bacteria is really important, and bacteria is naturally found everywhere. And so for me, when we talk about probiotics, I oftentimes tell the patients, you need to eat real food because bacteria exists there. Now, if you do have a disease that goes beyond and you're eating real food and you still are ill, then this next level of science is really important. And that's why I think, it's wonderful that Sunny has developed this company because these are the things that may be helpful. You buy probiotics on the shelf, most of them might be inactivated or they're dead, and you have no guarantee that it's going to actually help you. So another little fun fact I want to throw in there is my grandfather studied under the protege of Louis Pasteur. So put that into context. That is a short period of time in which we are understanding bacteriology. We have so much that is going on right now. I have no doubt that we're going to find some of the keys to these critical and chronic diseases.
So I want to go to the topic of diet. I think that all of you who are practicing in oncology, one of the questions you get almost more often than anything else is specifically partners, caregivers, etc., of a patient asking you, what should the patient eat? What should I do? And of course, now with all this new knowledge in microbiome, that is sort of even at a next level. Patient really would like to know because we understand that diet is a drug really for changes in microbiome. Studies that we have done and others basically show that within 48 hours when you change your diet, you see a change in your microbiome. So I want to ask all of the panel members to give their views, and maybe just say what do you say to your own family and to your friends when they ask you this question. So let's start with Dr. Jain.
Sure. Maybe the first place to even start that conversation is what we had for lunch today. I thought it was a great microbiome meal with fantastic color and fantastic fibers and protein on it. But from my lens, and we are kind of trained to think about food as nutrition for our human bodies. And you have 30 trillion human cells that compose your human body, but each of those cells houses essentially its own similar DNA across all of those cells. You have 39 trillion microbial cells that are actually living in your intestinal tract, an equal, if not greater, number of cells. But the DNA elements of those cells are actually really diverse. And so when we talk about precision nutrition and we talk about nutrition in general, I start to put my microbiology hat on and wonder if our biology is truly our microbiology. And the reason that we're eating these foods and fibers and diverse array of foods is to feed the microbes so they in turn can create the benefit for our human self. And when I think about fibers and soluble fibers, insoluble fibers, oligosaccharides, botanicals, I see arugula feeding Faecalibacterium prausnitzii. I see the lentils from our plate feeding Roseberia hominis. I see the grapefruit from our lunch today feeding polyphenols and beneficial things that are going to drive the nutrient supply for the commensal organisms that in turn release those positive postbiotics. So that's our view of your lunch today and precision nutrition.
Thank you.
Well, I'm glad I got the endorsement of Sonny because I helped to design the lunch.
Oh, I figured you had something to do with it. Great job. Great job.
So, and I can tell you that, it's true, we are beginning to recognize the elements in food, foods that taste good, by the way, that actually can be helpful. But if you wanted some general principles, which is probably where we're at when it comes to the rigor. So let's not go beyond our ski tips. We do know that if you want a healthy, diverse microbiome with generally good organisms, and we don't understand fully what all that means, but generally good gut health, you're not going to feel queasy in your stomach. Your overall inflammation levels, good gut bacteria, lower body inflammation, which is obviously beneficial for cancer prevention, cancer treatment, and preventing recurrence of cancer. That's a pretty generally accepted concept, but we don't have the data on how much bacteria you need. We may never actually get to the exact pinpoint number in our lifetime, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do something about it. So when it comes to food, I would say most plant-based foods that are whole foods are going to actually have the bioactives, so-called prebiotics, and many foods have dietary fiber that's going to be healthy and helpful for you. So, whole grains, legumes are great examples. Leafy greens, the little baby bok choy that you had for lunch today, that's a decent source of both dietary fiber as well as a bioactive called isothiocyanates that have been shown to be beneficial as well. You don't need to memorize any of the things that I'm telling you other than to know that, the greens and the colorful plates, that, the things that we're told are good for us. We're beginning to drill down to know that in addition, benefiting the gut microbiome is actually really healthy. I could, go on, I wrote 2 books. They contain over 300 foods, and they all contain ingredients and food ingredients that are actually good for lowering immune inflammation and gut microbiome. I'll tell you things that I think that you might want to call out, like pomegranates and elagitanins, kiwis, pears are a great source of dietary fiber. It's a winterish food. People always ask me for the practical stuff. I like to cook, so I could actually take you shopping with me, and or I could go shopping with you and help you pick out things. It's not difficult. I generally tell people that the wisdom of the Mediterranean diet or the Asian diet is pretty much on track. So if you can find something healthy that you like, that you would cook yourself with whole foods along those genres, you're probably getting something that's good for your gut microbiome. As importantly, though, I think there are things that we need to be cautious about in addition to antibiotics. I think the ultra-processed foods with a lot of food additives, food coloring, artificial preservatives, artificial flavorings, these are the sneaky things that most of us don't realize we're putting into our shopping cart. So I encourage everyone to pick up, whenever you go into the grocery store, pick it up, whatever you're picking up, and look at the ingredient label. All right, there's a disclosure there that food companies are required to actually have. And if there's something there you don't recognize what the function is, it's probably one of those things that are starting to be discovered that could injure your gut microbiome. If you're a regular athlete, it might compromise your performance. If you're a cancer patient, it just might compromise your ability to overcome your illness or to respond to treatment. So I think in the context of the Nixon National Cancer Conference, what I'm trying to underscore is that we cannot ignore this topic. We can't ignore what we tell patients to eat, nor can we ignore the importance of funding more research and sharing that information so that we can actually help patients appreciate that the food as medicine that they do at home, invisible to the oncologist's office, could make a difference in terms of their outcome.
Dr. Raskin.
Boy, I think he wrote the book on it, so to speak. Food is difficult, and I say that because disordered eating is very common in the United States, both in polar aspects. We have individuals who have compulsion to eat a lot, and we do that for many different reasons. As we know, the rates of obesity in the United States are close to 50%, as Joan London pointed out. But we also have the opposite side, where we have patients that cannot eat, both for medical reasons and then maybe even financial reasons. So we have to recognize that in the United States, a country of great wealth, there are many food deserts. There's poverty on the levels where individuals have only few options of what they can eat. So while we can recommend these things, they may not be available. And I have to be very careful when I'm considering that with my patients. They may not have the resources, the ability, and then specifically with the surgical patient, their intestines in their body may not be ready to receive certain nutrition. And what I mean by that is when we do surgery, patients on their gut, their intestines naturally slow down. This is a mechanism, a protective mechanism. And sometimes our patients' intestines even slow down to the point where they don't peristalse, they don't move food along. So while we want to get them back eating regular food, they can barely tolerate ice chips. They can barely tolerate sips of water. And so when I recommend what to eat, number one, it goes, what can you physically eat? Number two is, what do you like to eat? And then obviously, not the junk food avenue, although Michael Pollan, a food writer, once said, go ahead and eat junk food as long as you make it yourself. And so you kind of get thinking like, oh gosh, how would I make Cheetos or, but number one, what can you physically eat? Number two, what do you like to eat? Number three, what is food that's going to nourish you? So we have to keep all of these things in mind. And when the body is ready to start receiving nutrition, we can add in all these elements that Dr. Lee is talking about. He's absolutely right about the phytonutrients that exist in plants and the healthy omega-3s that we had in the salmon this afternoon. But we have to recognize that eating and food is a really complicated topic for all of us. And we have to take each patient individually to understand what is right for them.
Thank you. So just to add to that, so you heard a lot about fiber, and that is probably in all of the guidelines that are out there, is probably the one thing that holds up, that most people would say eating fiber at a certain dose, because too much fiber can actually be bad also, that is beneficial. And just to put a little bit of mechanism behind that, why is that? Because fiber is one of the major foods for commensal anaerobes, and those are those normal bacteria that live in your gut and are really critical for many processes. So if you look at all these studies that have shown that damage to the gut microbiome leads to whatever, in neuro, in cancer, cardiac, whatever, one of the common features is damage to the commensal anaerobes. So that's maybe why fiber can be out there as something that we can recommend to many. The other thing that I want to emphasize, there are many other things that have impact on the gut microbiome. It's not just a diet. We did a study where we took transplant patients from all over the world, Japan, Germany, US. And we thought that the starting point for all of these patients would be different based upon different diets, right? That the Germans eating pretzels, yes, that's lame, but anyway, that would be different. Turned out that we saw no differences at all. And why do we think that that was? Because these were cancer patients who had gone through already a year of all kinds of treatments and treatment with antibiotics. And at that point, we saw sort of a universal damage all over the world to all of these patients. Final point that I want to make, yes, antibiotics, of course, have major impact, but we just finished a study, which we published also, where we looked at about 60+ drugs that transplant patients take commonly for pain, for nausea, etc. And many of these other medications, actually almost all of them, had also impact. So where we might be heading for is that in our choice of a nausea medication or a pain medication, that we factor in also what kind of damage does that do to microbiome. With that, I think we should go now to the public part, right? And ask maybe for some questions from the audience.
Well, thank you for your approval of the Mediterranean diet. I loved it. And now I'm going to have to ask a question that I hate to ask because I think you're going to burst my bubble and disappoint me. I know the answer, but I have to ask it anyways. So I've been joking that I love my microbiome to the point that I like to keep it happy and slightly drunk from time to time. So the question is, what about alcohol?
Does any of the panel members want to tackle that? You want to take that one?
Yeah, we've actually looked at this in some detail. We have about 60,000 metagenomic microbiome profiles in our database, and it's one of the key questions we ask on a health and diet survey intake is, do you consume alcohol and what frequency level? Essentially, the take-home message, unfortunately, you are correct. Alcohol will cause a dysbiosis, essentially disrupting the existing and perturbating the existing microbiota. However, the good news is you can recover that quickly. And what we always recommend is making sure you have a baseline so you know where you are. So if you do go on an event where it's such an amazing gala that you have maybe one too many, that you don't end up in a dysbiosis later, and then you know where to get back to.
No, I want to add to that, which is, where are we going? At this conference, we're supposed to speculate or envision where we might head in the future. And I think that in the sense that cancer prevention, clearly, the gut microbiome is going to play some role. We haven't fully defined it yet, but I think that as we get more insight into the benefits for protecting health and wellness that our gut microbiome confers to us, we will start to embody that in preventative techniques. But for cancer patients, one of the things that, we do so many tests for cancer patients, tumor markers, blood tests, CBC, MRIs, PET scans. I think that in the future, we will be also doing microbiome sequencing at the very beginning so we can see what those changes are going to be. And if they are changed, whether it's due to the therapy or maybe an adjunctive therapy for an antibiotic that's been given for surgery or steroids that have been given for some other antecedent complication, we might want to recover those. Now, I want to just say, I took part in a fecal microbiome transplant that was done at MD Anderson Cancer Center in a cancer patient. And this patient was a complete responder to immunotherapy, checkpoint inhibitors, a few years ago, and then had a colitis and was on heavy-duty antibiotics and steroids for about 6 months. Sonny and I worked on this case, and we were able to profile we didn't have starting microbiome sequencing, but we had the impact of the antibiotics and the steroids. When he had cancer recurrence and was retreated with checkpoint inhibitor, he had no response. Perhaps not surprising given what our conversation is about today, but we were able to document that, which is important. And then what we started to do was to think about what could be a treatment. So using an FDA-authorized single-use IND, we were able to find a super responder among a stool bank. So imagine this, there are actually data or specimens being collected of individual cancer patients who are super responders to immunotherapy, recognizing that their fecal matter might actually be a treasure trove that we don't fully understand, but we can transplant that. So there are clinical trials now being done. So I took part in one of the first fecal microbiome transplant from a super responder to a non-responder, and then with Sunny's help, we were able to characterize the return of the microbiome, both in diversity. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, it was a really interesting journey for this individual patient to see how you could start from a non-responder level of gut diversity and assess that compared to a group of pre-published healthy individuals, pre-published people that are already known to be non-responders, and then see where now a new patient would fit. Do they fit into the responder or non-responder category? And through the sort of direct and deliberate restructuring through an FMT, and then also precise selection of fibers, oligosaccharides that you know are going to drive the diversity index up, you can actually recover that in really quick fashion. And we found that over a couple of weeks because of the time.
Just about 12 days, and then also we could document it, which is important. So this wasn't intended to be a treatment for that we could generalize, but it was for an individual. Now, for anybody who wants to actually know what's going on with the gut microbiome, because at the end of the day, I think this is the beginning of a new field. If I were mentoring a medical student now who is interested in my recommendation for a future area to go into for research, I would deliberately tell them to go to the microbiome. It's going to make the future of medicine different than what we have right now. If you're interested, go to PubMed, the National Library of Medicine, look up microbiome and cancer, and you'll see the rise in papers that are coming out and incredible journals. If you want to find out the clinical trials that are going on, that are serious and well-designed, look up clinicaltrials.gov, our nation's repository of clinical trial listings. Look up microbiome and cancer, and you will get a flavor of just how big and how deep this field already is, and be able to follow it going forward.
You just said flavor with microbiome and fecal transplant at the same time. I don't know that I've ever heard that, but
I will tell you there is a bacteria that has been studied clinically. I think we want to focus our efforts really, there's a lot of basic research, and I mentioned this last night, that Andy von Eschenbach and I share the passion for science, but we really want to see things happen to patients. And so we have to look at what's happening in the clinic. So if you look at microbiome studies in the clinic, what's really interesting is that there are some probiotics, so they're not universally questionable, but if you look at the clinical studies, there's a probiotic that was published just a few years ago showing that it can actually ameliorate the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, PS128. There is another one called Lactobacillus reuteri, made by BioGaia, that's been studied. It actually improves the oral microbiome, and it actually it kills the bacteria that causes cavities and gum disease, which then are associated with neurodegenerative diseases. And so I think that, what we have to do as researchers is just like drug development. Look at the targets, characterize the mechanisms, try to figure out how to design the translational studies. But whenever there's something clinical, we definitely want to pay attention to that.
Yeah, I actually just would like to follow up because you hit on a very interesting point. So the case that you actually described about this checkpoint blockade patient who then failed, there are several studies that have shown now where they did something similar. A patient is on a checkpoint blockade, fails. They do a fecal transplant with Flora from a patient who did well with a checkpoint blockade and can actually reverse outcomes. We have done something similar in mouse models for CAR cell therapy and can do exactly the same. So you give a mouse, a germ-free mouse, an avatar mouse, you give him Flora from a patient who did well with CAR cells versus mice that are avatar mice with Flora from patients who didn't do well with CAR cell therapy, and you see the same outcomes. So there's a lot of promise there actually to try to really untangle, as you mentioned, what are the elements of that. In terms of bringing this forward, fecal transplant, of course, is being done in a number of settings now. Started actually with Chinese therapies way back hundreds of years ago for C. diff already in those days, and in the 1950s within the US. But at the moment, it is being tried for IBD and for many other diseases. We have tried to take it one step further by not just working with a healthy donor, because we don't know what that is, and really zoom in on the specific bacteria. So we have worked with a composition of actually 17 bacteria that we could demonstrate were potentially beneficial, and do that within the context of allogeneic transplant. And my personal bias is that those kind of carefully designed type of fecal transplants, if you can still call that fecal, are probably a little bit more promising than trying to bank on normal, healthy donor stool. I think there was another question there in the back, no? Yeah, no, there's a question there.
It was very interesting. A few years ago, I was reading a newspaper where they were actually asking for donors to give fecal samples. I was shocked at what I read. And they were talking about doing a microbiome study. I was just wondering if any of you were aware of that or had any comments, because nobody ever heard of what the results were from that. I didn't.
I'm not sure if any of you know about this study, because I don't know what they were collecting them for. Did they tell you that?
No, it was just an ad for collecting and to do a study on microbiome. And that was a few years ago, and I think it was in Irvine.
So there's been a few companies out there that have worked on creating stool repositories, basically, and characterizing that stool for the future use of FMT. And I think University of Minnesota has a biorepository, and there are a few other companies that have enabled that movement for clinicians and clinical researchers to be able to access that stool for future use in clinical trials. So that's probably what that was intended to do. And our perspective is, yes, that's a great starting point, but perhaps, as Dr. Vandenbrink is saying, is figure out the precise combination of microbes and apply a more precision approach than the kind of shotgun reboot of the GI system.
You know, when I first took part in fecal transplantation for patients in the intensive care unit, this may sound kind of gross, but we asked the chief resident to go get a blender from the Goodwill. And then we found a family member of the patient who was healthy. And you can guess what we did with the material. And then we had to put it down a nasogastric tube into the stomach. But we also then migrated to using a colonoscope to go up to the top of the colon and then spray the colon with the content of their loved one that was donating. And so now what we're talking about is having more precision capacity to recognize what are those key elements that we're looking for. And maybe a donor, just like a kidney transplant donor, could be matched to another person to help, you know, cure disease. So we've come so far, even within my short career, from, you know, the Goodwill blender to now having companies that make products that are very specific.
So I think everybody has this image of the Goodwill blender now in their head. Okay.
It's cheap, a lot cheaper than most medical technology, but.
There are actually YouTube videos about that you can find. But does anybody dare to ask a question after that comment? Yes, a brave soul.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting that one of the anecdotes for me is, although he fell into disrepute for other reasons, when Lance Armstrong was a miraculous recoverer from testicular cancer with brain mets, et cetera, we attributed it to the 3 drugs that we were giving him. But at the same time, what was interesting about him as a patient, as a person, was in training for Tour de France, et cetera, he would consume enormous amounts of food. The caloric intake was incredible. So he was really overdosing if you will, on what might have been the nutrition or nurturing of his microbiome. So my question for you is, are we looking in the wrong place? We're looking at the microbiome in cancer patients, trying to figure out what's wrong. Chris Draft is here. What about looking in super athletes who are really following very, very prescribed and very intensive dietary regimens and checking their microbiome? And maybe we're finding they may have some of the secrets for those who are diseased.
So I'm actually a marathon runner, and there is already a study where they looked at the microbiome of marathon runners, which is different, and indeed people have been thinking about trying to get a fecal transplant from Kipchoge, if you know who that is, to get your marathon running prowess up. So there are people looking at that. Okay, good. But sorry, I think others wanted to answer.
Listen, I think this is a question of funding. We need to actually have enough funding to be able to drive research, to be able to collect and the data, as well as the material, and then to run the studies. I also think that the private sector is also an opportunity where entrepreneurs and companies that are working in this space can gather this kind of data to provide more information. The big picture, I think, is that the microbiome is here, it's real, it's important, research is going on. What we're finding is that it's significant, and a significant issue for cancer patients. And there is something that we can all do. I mean, whether you're a cancer patient or not, or don't want to get cancer, is we can actually choose, we can be mindfully what we actually eat. And it doesn't take very much research to figure out what are the foods that are good for our gut health.
So thank you very much. I think on that note, with that closing statement, we can close this session. Thanks to everybody.